Close your eyes for a moment and try to summon the specific smell of a British school in the 1970s or 80s. It was a unique bouquet of industrial floor polish, dust, and the faint lingering aroma of overboiled cabbage from the canteen. But for many of us, the most memorable sensation wasn't the smell, it was the fear. I'm not talking about double maths or the cross-country run in the freezing rain. I'm talking about the morning roll call. The teacher would open that massive leather-bound register, the Book of Judgment, and silence would fall. For most children, it was a boring routine, but for a select, unfortunate few, alphabetical order was a form of psychological warfare. While the Smiths and the Joneses could relax, there were children sitting in those wooden desks, knowing that in approximately 30 seconds their surname would be read aloud and their social life would be destroyed for another 24 hours. Today, we are opening the School Register of Doom one last time. We are looking at 20 historic British surnames that have effectively gone extinct in the modern world. These aren't just words, they are casualties of a changing society, victims of immigration, and, most brutally, victims of the British playground. Let's begin, shall we? First, we must address the most significant casualties in our register, the Bottom Brigade. Now, if you were to ask a historian or a linguist, they would push their glasses up their nose and tell you that in Old English, the word bottom simply meant a valley or a hollow in the ground. It was a perfectly respectable geographical description. A ram's bottom was merely a valley where rams grazed. A long bottom was just a long valley. It was innocent, it was pastoral, it was beautiful. However, try explaining 12th century etymology to a classroom of 13-year-old boys in 1982. It is an impossible task. To the adolescent mind, bottom means one thing and one thing only. The undisputed king of this category was, of course, Shufflebottom. It is a name that almost defies belief. It conjures a mental image that no amount of dignity can overcome. To be a Shufflebottom in a British comprehensive school was to build a character of steel, simply because you had no other choice. Then there was Sidebottom, a name that invites questions about posture that nobody wants to answer. We also had Winterbottom, which sounds unpleasantly chilly, and Higginsbottom, which just sounds chaotic. In the industrial north of England, particularly Lancashire and Yorkshire, these names were once as common as chimney stacks. They filled the phone books and factory records. But as the decades rolled on, the relentless comedy value became too much to bear.
Slowly but surely, the Shufflebottoms and Ramsbottoms began to quietly disappear. They changed their names by deed poll, or they emigrated to countries like Australia or Canada, perhaps hoping that a new continent might offer a fresh start, far away from the echoing laughter of the British playground. Next, we move to a group I like to call the substitute teacher's nightmare. We all remember the tension when a regular teacher was off sick and a stranger took the desk. They didn't know the local rules, they didn't know the agreed-upon pronunciations, they were walking into a linguistic minefield. The most famous trap in this minefield was undoubtedly Cockburn. Now, history tells us this is a distinguished Scottish name derived from noble families and brave soldiers. Social etiquette insists that we pronounce it Coburn. But look at the spelling. The letters are all there, staring back at you in defiant block capitals. When a nervous supply teacher paused at the letter C, the entire class would hold its breath. If they pronounced it phonetically, the room would erupt. If they corrected themselves to Coburn, the room would still erupt, just with more irony. But the Cockburns had it easy compared to the Glasscocks. Yes, Glasscock. Believe it or not, this was once a perfectly normal occupational surname, likely referring to someone who blew glass. But as we moved through the 20th century, the innocence of the word cock vanished entirely. To be a Glasscock in a 1980s comprehensive was not just difficult, it was a daily exercise in crisis management. It is no surprise that in the age of the internet, this surname has become almost statistically invisible. Then we have Swindles. Can you imagine the hurdle of trying to be taken seriously in business with this name? Trust me, I'm Mr. Swindles. It sounds like a villain from a Dickens novel who steals orphans' pocket money. And finally, we must mention the tragic decline of Dick. It's not a surname, but its fall of grace affects us all. There was a time when Dick was the standard, rugged shortening of Richard. We had Dick Turpin, Dick Whittington. But somewhere around 1990, the playground jury reached a verdict. You could be a Rich, a Rick, or a Richie, but you could no longer be a Dick. The giggling was simply too loud to ignore. Sometimes the cruelty of a surname didn't require a dirty mind or a mispronunciation. Sometimes the problem was that the name meant exactly what it said. It wasn't an innuendo, it was a description.
In medieval times, names were practical. If you were a Smith, you were Smith. If you were brown-haired, you were Brown. But what happened when your ancestors handed down a description that sounded like a playground insult? Take the surname Smellie. Etymologically, this is a tragedy. It likely comes from small meadow or smiley. It has nothing to do with hygiene. But try telling that to a Year 7 class. The phrase smelly by name, smelly by nature was virtually guaranteed to follow these children around like a bad odor. It didn't matter if they bathed in Chanel No. 5, the label was stuck fast. Then we have the tragic case of the Dafts. Centuries ago, the word daft meant mild, gentle, or meek. It was a compliment. But an English language is a cruel mistress. Over time, the meaning drifted until it became a synonym for stupid or foolish. Imagine the daily humiliation of a teacher shouting across the hall, "Don't be daft, Daft." It's a miracle any of them stayed in the country. We must also spare a thought for the go-to-beds. Yes, it is a real name. One can only imagine the exhaustion of hearing "time to go to bed" every single night of your childhood. It's enough to give anyone insomnia. But the gold medal for literal horror goes to the surname Death. It sounds like fiction, but Death, sometimes spelled D-ath to soften the blow, was an old Anglo-Saxon name. It is the ultimate conversation killer. Imagine the scene in a hospital waiting room. "The doctor will see you now, Dr. Death." Or a wedding invitation inviting you to celebrate the union of Mr. Smith and Miss Death. It is simply too heavy a burden for modern shoulders to carry. Today, there are fewer than 40 people in the entire UK brave enough to keep Death on their passport. It is a name that has, quite literally, died out. Not every surname on our casualty list disappeared because it was rude. Some vanished for the exact opposite reason. They were victims of aggressive cuteness. Consider the plight of the honeybuns. It is a delightful word. It sounds like something you'd find in a bakery window in Devon. But names are context dependent. Honeybun is fine when whispered by a loved one. It is significantly less fine when shouted across a construction site or a muddy rugby pitch. Imagine a 6'4" docker from Liverpool trying to introduce himself as Big Dave Honeybun. The cognitive dissonance is simply too great. Similarly, we have Goodchild. This name was likely given to a well-behaved medieval infant, but in the modern school system, it was a target on one's back. The pressure to live up to the name Goodchild must have been suffocating. It's no wonder many of them grew up and rebelled, perhaps changing their name to something rebellious like Smith. And finally, we have the silent fading of the lost trades.
British surnames were often a CV. You were what you did.
But as technology marched on, the jobs died and the names began to feel like ghosts. We used to have streets full of Arkwrights, makers of chests, Cartwrights, makers of carts, and ironmongers. But nobody makes wooden chests anymore. We buy flat-pack furniture. Nobody mungs iron. We order steel online. These names didn't vanish in a storm of laughter like the Shufflebottoms. They just quietly faded away, like the smoke from the factory chimneys that once defined them. They are echoes of a working-class Britain that no longer exists. It is easy to chuckle at the thought of a Mr. Cockburn marrying a Miss Daft, or a Shufflebottom trying to book a table at a fancy restaurant. But if we stop laughing for just a moment, there is a gentle melancholy to be found here. Every time one of these peculiar names disappears from the electoral roll, we lose a tiny thread of our history. We lose a connection to the muddy valleys of Lancashire, to the medieval bakeries, and to the eccentric, unpolished character of the British Isles. We seem to be moving towards a world that is safer, more sanitized, and easier to pronounce. But frankly, a world full of only Smiths and Joneses is a bit boring, isn't it? I miss the go-to-beds. I miss the ironmongers. I even miss the Smellies. They made the world a more colourful, if slightly more confusing place. But now I want to turn the register over to you. Think back to your own school days. Who was the classmate with the name that made the supply teacher pause? Did you know a Winterbottom, a Glasscock, or perhaps you knew a legend who bore one of these names with absolute pride? Please share your memories in the comments below. Let's keep these names alive in digital ink, even if they have vanished from the parish records. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane of the school register of doom, please do give this video a like. It helps the channel more than you know. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the Nostalgia Brit for more weekly dives into the quirky history of our past. Until next time, cheerio!